Welcome to the Reach Podcast with your teacher, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
The most physically challenging thing I've ever done my entire life. I went through a tryout, and there was a portion of the tryout where we had to do these team building exercises, and there was this one particular, they were all pretty physically challenging, but the one that I remember, it's like burned, scarred into my psyche at this point. It was called Down Pilot. Down Pilot, again, it's a team building exercise, but it's loosely based on the idea of you got to carry this wounded pilot that can't walk out of this area, right? So you go in and you get them and you take them out, right? And to do this team building exercise, we had to build these H-frames out of these metal poles. Okay, so we took these metal poles and we strapped them together, and then we laid across the top of it a stretcher, right? And on the stretcher, they put like a 200-pound sandbag, which, like, that's a heavy pilot. But basically, you had to go get this guy, and we had our rucksacks on, our backpacks, right? And they had maybe somewhere between 55, 65 pounds in them already. And then what we did was we took the poles from this H-frame and we set them on top of our rucks. And the combined weight of the rucksack and the downed pilot, it was so much weight distributed between four people that it actually had an effect on your mental capacity, right? So you have to carry it on your shoulders like this, and you have to just walk miles. And you're walking up hills, you're walking through sand, mud, whatever it is. You're just going. And you have no idea, by the way, when it's going to end. That makes it even worse because there's something mentally challenging about, like, are we going 10 more feet or are we going 10 more miles? I don't know. But we're trudging along, and I remember that there was 9 of us, and there was 2 frames. So 8 people were always carrying it. And keep in mind, when you locked this thing in, you couldn't even fall down without like serious risk of injury. This thing would lock you in from the hips up. Nothing could shift because nothing could move. There's no give on the metal bar, right? So it's locked into your shoulders. Your shoulders are locked into this rucksack, and you are just having to just move your legs forward. And every time somebody else moves slightly a different direction, that pulls it. So now you're just weaving off balance, stepping into sand. So now your hips are shifting. It was excruciating. And I remember you reach this point where you are thinking to yourself, maybe if I just break my ankle on purpose, I can stop. Like whatever it takes to not be here right now. And it gets so bad in your head. There's only one person taking a break at a time. And we had a system so that every minute or so that person takes a spot, that person comes out, then they take another spot, so on and so forth, right? So you kind of get out for like 60 seconds and catch your breath, and it's like the blood flows again, and you're like, this is the worst moment of my life. And then you put it back on, and instantly it's just tunnel vision, everything's terrible. And it's so bad, like the guy that's taking a break, he's trying to like encourage people, and he's like, you can do it. Everyone's like, get away from me, right? It's a terrible experience. And what I remember though, is that when that guy that was taking a break, when he got around to your position, you knew, like he's watching the clock, and you knew you were about to get subbed out. Somebody was about to take your place. And the burden that you were currently bearing, locked into, unable to get out of, it was about to be taken off your shoulders and given to someone else. And as soon as that burden moved, that inescapable, terrible burden, as soon as it moved, you felt the relief in every part of your body. From the inside out, you felt relief. You knew that something had changed way, way for the better. It was a relief that could barely be explained. See, you're burdened. You're burdened in this life. From the time that you enter into it until until you get someone to take that burden off your shoulders. And it's weighing you down, and it's locked in, and there's no way out of it. There's no way to escape that burden. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable, and my burden is light." See, tonight, I don't want you to miss this. Tonight is about being attached to your sin or having your sin attached to God. He can either sub you out of that, or you can stay locked into that burden. But as long as you're locked into that burden, it's the worst experience you can possibly have. Every moment of it is excruciating. And as soon as you get that burden lifted off of you, you will feel it in every part of you. You will understand the freedom of not being yoked to your sin. This is why Paul uses language about being yoked when he talks about believers marrying non-believers, right? It's a similar concept. It's that the world drags believers down when it's attached to them. In the same way that sin drags you down, it's incapable of dragging Christ down. See, you're not strong enough, but He is. He can bear that burden, and He will burden you with Himself, which is effectively a great thing. And Jesus wants to bear your burden. We're in a series in the book of Numbers called The Angry God. We're talking about the angry God of the Old Testament. And what we've been looking for is we've been looking at stories that at the surface level, it just looks like wrath. Just this mean, bearded guy in the clouds throwing lightning bolts at people, right? And we've seen some crazy stories. I'm sure some of you have not read Numbers, and you've listened to some of these stories like, what is happening, right? And the cool thing that we've been looking for in this series is we've been looking at these wrathful moments, and we've been saying, okay, but look, if you look closely, there's God's mercy and His love. There's God providing a way out. There's God shielding His people from His wrath, right? And we see that clearly in the New Testament, but it seems so obscure in the Old Testament that we have to look closer at it. But we've seen that God's wrath always involves His mercy, that He protects His children. So at this point in the story, we've seen Israel basically do nothing but complain. They've gone downhill. They're wandering around in the wilderness. Everything's bad. They keep blaming God, blaming Moses for everything. Last week, we saw Balaam and how Balaam was on a get-rich-quick mission. But instead, God basically cornered him and said, if you do anything to oppose my people, I'll kill you. See, in that moment, away from all the complaining in Israel, where they didn't even know what was going on up in the mountains, God cornered their enemy and dominated him and said, I will not let you hurt my children. And what we learn from that is that God is protecting us and providing for us even when we can't see it. Well, Balaam tells Balak that there's another way. Now, I want you to see this. I'm going to read in chapter 31, in verse 15, it says, And Moses said to them, Have you spared all the women? Behold, they caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to be unfaithful to the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the plague took place among the congregation of the Lord. The reason I read you that verse right off the bat is because Balaam's name is not mentioned anywhere in chapter 25, but what we're going to see is everything that happens in chapter 25 is malicious. It's not an accident. It's not innocence. It's not a mistake. It is a rebellion to God. And it's been incited by Balaam. See, if you read the story of Balaam that we covered last week, if you just read through that and you don't really look too closely, it can appear as though Balaam's the good guy. But the rest of Scripture testifies that Balaam remained a bad guy in the eyes of the Lord, and what happens in chapter 25 is all his fault. See, in chapter 25, what we're going to see is the Israelites intentionally choosing to be yoked to the world, to be burdened by something other than God. Look at chapter 25, starting in verse 1. While Israel remained at Sittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel became followers of Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry with Israel. So we know that God has told Israel not to marry outside of their nation and their faith, right? They're explicitly told not to marry anyone from the surrounding nations, and there's some accusations that come with this all the time. People say, well, that proves the Bible's racist, or it proves that God is a legalist, right? The Old Testament's all about legalism, but here's the reality. What God was doing with that command is he was trying to protect them from a seduction to idolatry. See, he wasn't worried about them marrying a foreign woman. He was worried about them being so invested in a foreign woman that they leave their God behind and take up her gods. God hates sin because it takes us from him. See, God is the source of life. God is the thing that fills us up. And he hates sin not because he's just a fuddy-duddy, not because he just doesn't want us to have any fun. He hates sin because sin is trying to kill us, and he loves us. I want you to understand that this is not just some guys in Israel looking for wives. Like there's not enough women around them in their own nation. This is Baal worship. See, Baal, who shows up here for the first time, he's a fertility god or a storm god, but he was associated with their crops coming in, right, with the rains coming, and for them, the cycle of life, it all went back to worshiping Baal. Now, what we're going to see here is that Baal worship included having sex with cultic prostitutes at the temple because that was a fertility ritual. Now, that's implied here. We'll see more of why that's in the story later, but it's implied here, and part of the reason it's implied is this. The Israelite men are not abandoning God so they can have dinner and bow, right? If you just read the text and you're like, they gave up everything so they can have like a home-cooked meal somewhere else and then bow down to an idol, that's not what's happening. See, that stuff is just the passage into what they're really being seduced towards, which is this cultic fertility ritual. There's something at the end, and they're willing to go through all the stuff that happens before that to get to that point. That is what they're being seduced to. And to make the point that this isn't about race or legalism, you just have to look at the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite woman. And yet, Ruth abandons her own home and culture. She is used as the example of a godly woman. If you don't know this, but in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth comes right after Proverbs 31. Ruth is pointed to as the example of a godly woman, and she's not even an Israelite. She marries an Israelite, and she's blessed. Look at verse 4. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill his men who have become followers of Baal of Peor." Okay, so I want you to see something. There seems to be a discrepancy in the commands there. God's like, kill all the leaders. And then Moses seems to turn around and say, kill the people responsible, right? And so some commentators have suggested that Moses is actually disobeying God here, and he's basically going out of his way to try to not make the punishment not as bad, right? I don't think the text leaves room for that. What is actually happening here is an ancient Near Eastern literary technique. So what we're seeing is that the story is going to go from big to small and specific, and then again to big, right? And so what we're seeing is that the broad strokes of what God said are conveyed in the first portion. Moses is giving clarifications that he no doubt got from God. And then we're going to go even more specific to one instance that results from this entire episode. So keep in mind, big moving to small, and then you'll see at the very end that it flares out again. Why does God say to impale the offenders? He's trying to set an example so that other people won't turn and do that sin. See, that's why God punishes sin, because it's a testimony in and of itself to others that that's not the right way to go. It's not successful, right? Don't go there. It ended poorly, right? And at the same time, there's already a plague happening. I read that to you in verse 31. It's implied here, but it will say it more clearly as we go on. There's a plague in the camp because the people have turned away from God. And not just turned away from God. Again, this isn't a mistake. They are in rebellion. Look at verse 6. Then behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from the midst of the congregation and took a spear in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the inner room of the tent and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through the abdomen. So the plague on the sons of Israel was brought to a halt, but those who died from the plague were 24,000 in number. Okay, picture this. You're a young Israelite man, and you're out in the town, and you meet this Midianite woman, and things are going well. You're hitting it off. You date for a while, and you finally build up the courage. You're like, I'm gonna take her home, meet my parents. It's gonna be great. You get in there, and it's a little awkward, right? Your parents are like, Midianite, really? And then all of a sudden, the pastor kicks in the tent flap with a spear, and he's like, yeah, right? He's coming for you. Okay, that's not what's happening, but I just want to point out that premarital sex would probably be a lot easier to avoid the temptation of if you thought I could show up at any moment with a spear. That's all I'm saying. So what is actually happening here is a blatant rebellion. I want you guys to understand that. This is not a dating scenario. This is not, they're just innocently trying to meet the parents. That's not what's occurring. See, that's how we read this text. Right? But the reality is, this is an orchestrated and rebellious act. This is something designed to fly in the face of God. Right? See, the language here actually suggests that as Moses finishes relaying the commands, like the same instant, there's no break in time, he says, this is what God has said. And right as he finishes talking, they see a Midianite woman and an Israelite walking into a nearby tent in their sight as the plague is going on. The Israelite and the Midianite woman, they hear that. They know what's going on. They are in defiance. See, the tabernacle's at the center of the camp. See, when you do something that you know is wrong, where do you go? You go away from where you're going to be spotted. You go away from where God is. You go find the dark alleys, the corners, right? That's not what's happening here. They've come to the very center of the camp. They've brought their sin in the sight of the Lord, right at the front. That is where this is happening. This is an organized and defiant act of Baal worship. Phinehas, in this moment, what he is doing is that he is feeling in himself the same way that God feels about what's happening. Right? See, I tell you guys like all the time, we analyze words here. I don't like platitudes. I don't want to leave you guys hanging with stuff like that's just general. Right? What does it mean to be Christ-like? Because we say it all the time. It means that you actually act like Christ. That you actually behave the way he behaved, that you actually think the thoughts he thought, that you have the same emotions, that you care about the same things, that you have the same priorities. In this moment, Phinehas has the exact same emotion about something as God has. That's the goal. That's the whole point. if nothing else is accomplished in your life, except that you feel the same way about everything you see that God feels about it, you are there. You've made it. That's the whole goal. So often, the problems in our life, the reason that we're so frustrated by what God's doing is because we don't feel the same way about what God's doing as he does. Phineas, in this moment, feels what God feels. And he goes in this tent and he stabs them. And I want you to understand that, again, the language implies that they are in the act of having sex. He walks in and he catches them red-handed performing Baal worship. They are in the middle of this cultic ritual, and Phineas puts an end to it. He stabs them, and with one stroke, he hits both of them. He stabs them through the abdomen, and in that moment, he impales this Israelite man to his sin, and the plague that is on the camp is halted. God stops what is happening to everyone else. You guys hear me talk about types a lot, okay? Types, what are types? Types are when somebody in the Old Testament emulates God in a way that's designed to teach us about God. It's designed to point to God, right? Now I'm going to talk about an object lesson. An object lesson is similar. It's something that God gave as an example, as a tool to teach you something about salvation, something about the gospel, something about atonement, right? So it's not necessarily the person of Jesus, but it's the work of Jesus. That's what an object lesson is. So the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, it is an object lesson. It's something that God gave the people of Israel and the whole world through his revealed word to say, this is something you need. You need a substitute. You need a sacrifice. You need blood to pay for the sin that you owe. The sacrificial system is telling us that we need a blood sacrifice. See, you deserve to be impaled to your sin. That's the reality. The reality is that we have earned being impaled to our sin, being stuck to it forever, being burdened with it, yoked with it, and never being able to get out from under it. That's actually what we deserve. And the point of the Bible is that Jesus has offered to be impaled to your sin for you. In Colossians, it says that the record of our debt was nailed to the cross. In 1 Peter, it says Christ bore our sins in his body on a tree. In 2 Corinthians, it says he became sin who knew no sin. In Galatians, it says Christ redeemed us from a curse by becoming a curse. See, Phineas, in this moment, he is the high priest. He took a spear and he gave one man exactly what he deserved. But the beautiful thing is that someday the perfect high priest, Jesus Christ, will take a spear instead to his own side and cover what we have all deserved. That is the point of the Bible. It's that your burden, the sin that you deserve to be stuck to forever, Jesus has offered to stick it to himself and take it from you, to save you from it. That's what the gospel is. In this moment, God accepted the substitute from the high priest. When I say the word jealousy, there's a certain connotation that comes with it in our culture. I want you to understand that word jealousy in your heads, it's really a petty form of jealousy. It's more like a corrupted form of jealousy. Because why? Because if you picture a married couple and the wife goes out and she cheats on her husband and the husband gets jealous, what does that mean to you? It means he's insecure and he's mad at her, right? He's mad at her because she hurt him and it's about him feeling a certain kind of way, right? That's what that word jealousy means in our culture. But that, I want you to understand before we get into this next portion, that that's not what jealousy means right here. See, because jealousy in a perfect world is that if a wife ran off on her husband and cheated on him, committed an affair adultery against him is that he would have a jealousy at the thing that was stealing her. He would be angry at the thing that had seduced her. Why? Because that's not good for her. See, the safety of her marriage, the safety of her husband is what's good for her. And proper jealousy is not being insecure and mad at the person. It's being angry at the thing that is trying to take them away and hurt them. That is what jealousy looks like when it's God's jealousy. God's jealousy is that he is mad at the things that try to steal us and kill us because he loves us. Look at verse 10. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has averted my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, Behold, I am giving him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of a permanent priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. Atonement means a payment by substitute. The question we're trying to answer with this series, if you haven't figured it out by now, why does God look so wrathful? Why is God so angry at sin? And because we view our own sin as this kind of like petty mistake lifestyle, I'm a generally good person. I just mess up every now and again, right? That's the way we view our own sin. So we look at the Old Testament and we see their acts of sin and we chalk it up the same way. Well, they just made a mistake. I mean, they didn't know they were going to get killed for it. That's not the case. These are acts of spitting in God's face. That's what's happening here. And the reality that we don't want to acknowledge is that that's what our sin is. It is spitting in God's face. See, let's break this down. If you heard about a preacher in a church that had an affair, right? Like in the building, you'd be like, no brainer, that guy should get fired, right? Like he should be held accountable. That's not okay, right? Why? Because you look at him and you're like, well, he's a pastor, right? Like he's called to serve God and minister to people and lead them towards God. You see where I'm going with this? You're called to all that same stuff, right? See, you're held to the exact same standard. That's what we don't want to admit, but the reality is if you can look at that situation and think, no brainer, he should be held accountable for his blatant, sinful rebellion against God. But that's our own lives. And see, in the same way, the nation of Israel is called to be a nation of priests. That's what the church is. It's a whole collection of people ministering to the whole world, of showing people the gospel. See, in our culture, we hold people accountable differently, and it's a cultural difference, but that's what stoning someone, that's what the plagues were in the Old Testament. They were forms of holding people accountable. And then the question becomes this, well, why? Why do we have to hold people accountable? And why did people have to die in the Old Testament? Like, why was it necessary? Here's the thing. When you live in sin, you make it harder for people around you to meet Jesus Christ. That is not okay. And how is it that you could have received Jesus Christ and be okay with the possibility of letting other people miss it because you don't want to behave correctly? How selfish can we be? See, in the same way, the nation of Israel, when they behaved in rebellion, they were hindering the entire world from being pointed to the one true God. God took that very seriously. See, when we look at it correctly, God's not being harsh. This is what we deserve. We deserve this wrath. We deserve to be burdened with our sin. We deserve to be impaled to our sin. And see, that's the crazy part about the whole thing. That is what we deserve, and yet God has made a way where we don't have to do that. God made a way out. He made a way through it. He made a way to save us from it, and it's by taking it on himself. That's the whole point. You do deserve the wrath, and yet God has offered you the mercy. That's crazy. It says the plague killed 24,000 people. Listen, again, you wouldn't be surprised if a church, and we see this all the time actually, you wouldn't be surprised if a church that's tolerating sin on a regular basis failed. That's what the plague is. It wipes out groups of people who are tolerating sin. And it shouldn't be a surprise, because here's the reality. If not for the grace of God covering us at every second, we should all just be dying to plagues. It should be constant chaos and anarchy and murder. Like, that's all life would be if God wasn't stopping it at every given moment. So when we step outside of God's grace that's covering us, the plague comes. That's what's out there without God. God is jealous for your benefit. He wants you to be yoked to him. I told you that sin drags you down, and yet God is strong enough to pick it up. See, God has unequally yoked himself to you, but it's because he's strong enough to bear the burden for the both of us. Look at verse 14. Now the name of the dead man of Israel who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of the father's household among the Simeonites. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, who was the head of the people of a father's household in Midian. Okay, again, here's what this is pointing at. These people, these are not like nobody Israelites and nobody Midianites. These aren't the people on the edge of the camp already. These are like, this is a princess of Midian and a really well-known Israelite. This is an intentional spit in the face to God. That's all this can be. There's no way to look at this story and see God just being overly harsh with people. That's not what's happening. See, God commands them, he's going to command them to be hostile to Midian. He's going to command them to not be friendly with the world around them. See, American Christianity has this thing in it. I got to see this up close when I went to Brazil this year. I realized how much we've twisted the American dream into our Christianity. How much we've bought this lie that all the things that our culture are always telling us to aspire to, we've somehow co-opted that into our religion as though it's synonymous with God or with just being a Christian. See, the goal is not to blend with the world around us. The reality is that the world around us is dragging us down to death, and God has told us not to touch it. Look at verse 16. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Be hostile to the Midianites and attack them, for they have been hostile to you with their tricks, with which they have deceived you in the matter of Peor and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed on the day of the plague because of Peor." The world is it's dying, and it's trying to take you with it. That's what's happening. The world is groaning under its own burden. It's falling apart. And it's lashing out at everything it can touch. You need to get as far away from it as you can. See, if you were here when we talked about Korah's rebellion, they know that the judgment's about to come on the people who are rebelling. They know the ground is about to open up and swallow them. And what does God tell them? Get away from those people and don't even touch their stuff. Why? Because them and everything they have is going down to judgment. It's all going to disappear. You can't have 1 foot in the camp of the world and 1 foot in God's camp and be like, can I take some of this with me? It's not going to work like that. You're in one camp or the other, and if you're over here touching the things of the world, then when they go, you will go with them. He says that the world is trying to trick and deceive you. Look at verse 1 of chapter 26. Then it came about after the plague that the Lord spoke to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest. I wanted to include verse 1 of chapter 26 because I want you guys to see something. What happened because of the atonement? What happened that Phinehas made a blood sacrifice that he substituted and saved the nation? That they're able to talk to God again. That they're able to hear the voice of the Lord. Guys, if you were in Sunday school this last week, you heard me use this analogy. Your car is designed to run on gasoline. And if you just getting low on gas and you pulled up to the nearest field and you just stirred up some mud and dumped it into the gas tank, what would happen? Nothing. Your car would break. You'd be worse off than you were before you were running out of gas. Here's the thing. You are designed to run on God. It's the only thing that can fill you up. It's the only thing that can fulfill you. It's the only thing that can bring you joy. It's the only thing that can keep you going. And the world is just mud in your gas tank. It's not just bad. It's not just not going to help. It's actually going to make the situation worse. It has nothing to offer you. The atonement of Jesus Christ, the substitute of his death in your place, has given you the opportunity to be in the presence of the Lord, to speak to him, to know him, to walk with him, to be filled up by him. What happened in the same moment that Jesus was dying on the cross? We know that the veil that separated all of humanity from the Holy of Holies, the place where God was, the veil ripped from top to bottom, all the way in half. Why? Because the moment that God saw that Jesus had made the substitution, that his blood had redeemed us and paid the price, there was no more separation. There was no more need for separation. See, the wrath that separates us from God, our whole lives, suddenly the blood had paid the price and allows us to approach God. We don't have to go through another person. We go through Jesus Christ and we approach God clean, unburdened, not pinned to our sin. I just have one question that I want you guys to think about tonight, that I want you guys to think about as you leave here and this whole week. It's the only question that's going to matter in your entire life. It's a version of it. I ask this question all the time. The question is your sin still pinned to you? Or is it nailed to the cross? Because if your hope is in anything other than the blood that was spilled on the cross, then your sin is on your shoulders. And you don't have what it takes. But if your sin is nailed to the cross, if Jesus bore it for you, you can talk to God. You can now approach him. If you don't know, if you know Jesus, please come talk to me. Come talk to Matt. There's so many people in this room who know Jesus, and they would love to share him with you. This is the only question that will ever matter. And we're not guaranteed tomorrow, next week. We're not guaranteed the rest of tonight. Don't leave here without knowing that your sin is not nailed to you, but that Jesus Christ has taken it.
Guys, this is Matt O'Mealy, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that is defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We are available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.